Chapter 4 Dialogue Snappo had never drained himself quite so low before. The musculature of the legs particularly seemed weak as he walked toward the brook that morning. He had exhausted the fat juice cells for long-term storage around his chest and waist and buttocks, and now he was drawing on the prompt supply cells that fed his muscles. And those in his legs were nowhere near as plentiful as those that supplied the large pectoral muscles that powered the downbeat of his wings. The legs were always the first to go. That was an old Mystronian saying that Sarko and his ilk were fond of iterating, for some reason beyond the fact that it was true. And the truth of that adage was never more apparent than when he had started for the brook that morning. He had actually felt sort of faint after the long inactivity of a night's tether. Sarko had already left. That became apparent after breakfast as Snappo climbed to optimum charge altitude. Sarko was already on station in Snappo's favorite space immediately over the center of the compensator. Naturally, Sarko would be the only one of both tribes not to recognize that and defer to him. It was the first time he had violated that space without permission. Yet the times were unusual. Old, little-used protocols were easier to violate than those reinforced by continual use. The concept of preferred location was not a natural one with the Cerebrons, as it was with the Maestrians, who tended to stay in one location for long periods in the process of constructing and destroying weather node compensators, like the domed glimmer below. The Cerebrons did not normally spend the night on the ground, but instead tethered their reflectors together in large drifting night packs, interlacing their hooks. They were normally nomads, continually roaming all over the world in the state of deep cognition that had brought their race to the intellectual heights it now enjoyed. The last time they had anchored for any significant period of time was when both tribes were battling the weather effects of the great meteor fall a quarter century before the aliens arrived. Thus, preferred space was the Cerebran equivalent to the Maestrian preferred location. The preferred space was naturally toward the center of the pack, and the most exalted was dead center where the less taxing audio communication reached the greatest number of Cerebrons, and the surrounding elite first, and where the more taxing radio communication reached all the Cerebrons with the least expenditure of energy. When the two tribes interacted, as they were doing now, as they had during the meteor incident, the dominant tribe tended to be the Cerebrans unless the Maestrians had an unusually aggressive leader, and up until that morning Snappo had been the more aggressive in their interaction, despite the fact that it was Sarko and his Maestrians who were aggressively building the compensator. That was to be expected. Snappo would have been a little alarmed, contrary to the tenor of his words, if the Maestrians had performed otherwise. So, in the context of past behavior, it was surprising to find Sarko, with his hook pointed aggressively forward, on station in Snappo's space. The natural disposition of both tribes was peaceful, so Snappo meekly left his hook pointed aft and took up his station 2 wing spreads to the right of Sarko as Sarko circled around the center of the dome far below. "You're on the wing a tad early, Sarko," Snappo said. "I watched the alien land last night," Sarko said, "and monitored its jump into our zone 2 days before. That perhaps explains their discrete modulation of hyperwave, but not entirely. The metal monsters phase in with continuous modulations. How do you explain the jump? Do we have 2 different sets of aliens?" "No, not if I understand what Willer 9 is telling me. This new being is clearly a master of the metal ones. Well, this morning I'm joining you, and I'll be able to observe the construction almost as well from your station as from mine, and though I care not a whit for either set of aliens, it would be a shame to destroy life unnecessarily. I want to see for myself how you handle them." Snappo said nothing further for the rest of the short charge. He was already exhausted by the endless days of talk and the surfeit of poisonous oxygen that he felt compelled to hold in his sacs. But he continued to carry his hook aft so that Sarko would know that his silence was not intended as an affront. He could afford to allow Sarko to dominate this brief morning charge, but that was all he could allow him. They bawled and dropped as Sarko's people were forming up for construction. Snappo had not intended for Sarko to get ahead of him, but from habit set by the short time the aliens had been on their world, Snappo opened a glide path in his usual manner, which took him on a higher circular pass around the dome. Sarko chose to go in directly. By the time Snappo had realized that Sarko was not following, it was too late to correct his error. But he circled tight, high up, and began to dive well before he had completed the half circle. Snappo watched him through the transparent dome as Sarko made a fast, powered approach and aggressive landing. A powered stall a half-meter above the ground, with his wings spread to their full 10-meter breadth as he came to rest only 2 meters from the aliens. Snappo mentally cursed Sarko, but restrained himself and did not radiate his feelings as he might well have had he known the aliens could not receive his broadcast. A cloud of dust obscured Sarko and the aliens as Snappo came in on a flat, gentle glide path and settled to the ground well inside the cloud. He knew he was more majestic in the air, but he also knew his approach would be obscured by Sarko's dust, so he chose to come in closer than Sarko. Still, his approach was executed so adroitly that he added not a whit to the ball of dust that was already rapidly dissipating. There were 3 aliens. Wooler 9, a non-metallic being a head shorter, and a third being as tall as Wooler 9 that Snappo took to be non-metallic until he detected the neutrino radiation that characterized Wooler 9 and microfusion in general. He had to conclude that despite the deceptive appearance, the third alien must be of the servant tribe, although he knew that a quick generalization might be diplomatically embarrassing if it proved wrong. Sarko, at least, had the good sense not to open his oxygen vent prematurely, and it was apparent that Wooler 9 was confused and not able to distinguish between Snappo and Sarko. The robot's eyes kept flickering back and forth between the two of them. "Good morning, Wooler 9," Snappo said. There was no hesitation, no ignoring Snappo this morning. Wooler 9 swiveled his head and rolled his eyes around ahead of that motion, so they came to rest on Snappo well before the head caught up. "This is Miss Ariel Welsh," the robot said as he gestured with a rather grand motion toward the diminutive alien, who stood hardly as high as Snappo's shoulder joints. And with a nod, Wooler 9 dismissed the other alien as a servant beneath his consideration, a fact confirmed by his words. "And this is the humaniform Jacob Winterson, Miss Welsh's personal robot." The validity of Snappo's generalization was reassuring, as was his initial reaction to the small alien's unimpressive appearance. But Wooler 9 had failed to introduce Snappo, a breach of etiquette not easily forgiven, which was not reassuring. Still, the robot was only a servant, and perhaps not as well schooled in diplomacy as the small master, who was a she, a member of the subordinate clan of the dominant tribe. Snappo had guessed that she would be from his earlier conversations with Wooler 9. Yet that was also disappointing, since he would still not know, after all the interminable discussion that would surely take place, how dominant that other clan was, and whether that other clan would also dominate the tribes of his world if this Miss Welsh did not prove to do so. She was certainly not very imposing. But her personal robot was imposing, and he was only a servant. That left Snappo with nothing to go on at that point but superficial appearances, which he knew from long experience to be untrustworthy. And then, to Snappo's astonishment, Sarko was talking. "Welcome to our world, Miss Ariel Welsh," Sarko said. "My name is Sarko, which is as close as we can come to a translation into your language. I am the leader of the Miostria." That caught Snappo by surprise. He had not really expected Sarko to be fluent in the language. Sarko had a better command of the language than Snappo would have thought possible from the brief radiated lessons he had been given the Cerebrons. Sarko obviously monitored those lessons, but he could only have picked up the audio patterns by special tutoring from one of the Cerebron elite. And that, too, disturbed Snappo, Someone of the elite must be striking for dominance, and hard enough to risk undercutting Sinapo in his rivalry with Sarko. Sinapo was so caught by surprise that before he could even say anything, Sarko, with a gesture every bit as grand as Will o' Nine's, said, "And this is Sinapo, leader of the Cerebrons." Sarko's introduction could be taken two ways. Sinapo hoped the small alien placed Sarko's relationship to him in the same pattern as Will o' Nine to her. Had Sarko intended that to be the case? Had he misjudged Sarko's behavior during the charge that morning? "Yes, Miss Ariel Welsh, welcome to our world," Sinapo said. The small alien turned away, shaking all over, after suddenly putting her hand over her primary and secondary vents. She was obviously caught in a fit of ague. Will o' Nine studiously ignored her condition. The only reaction of the other, the humaniform, was a slight upward curvature at the corners of the robot's primary vent. Her behavior and theirs confused Sinapo and led him to wonder about the efficacy of the robots as suitable servants. Surely one of them should have done something to ease her paroxysm. She recovered quickly, however, and turned and said, "I am pleased to meet both of you." And then she put one hand to her front, the other to her back, and doubled over at the waist, which led Sinapo to wonder if she had now suddenly been caught in a cramp, like that which sometimes caught him when he was carrying too large an inventory of oxygen, as he was at that moment. But unlike her, if a cramp hit him in this situation he would suffer through and ignore it. That gave him a nice feeling of superiority. Chapter 5 Impasse. Ariel finally got control of herself and with a sober face turned back to face the aliens. Their frightening appearance had almost paralyzed her until the first one, Sarko, had spoken. Will o' Nine had pointed them out before they began their drop, while they were still lazily circling above the center of the dome. And then that first one had landed, coming in so fast it seemed like it could not possibly stop in time, and then unexpectedly spreading out his wings so wide he engulfed them all in a jet-black space, absolutely devoid of any detail, as though they were suddenly and inexplicably thrown into the featureless black concavity of the dome. When he retracted his wings they seemed to melt into his sides and disappear in the soft blackness. The contrasts of color, or lack of it, heightened the disturbing appearance of the alien. The vicious white hook that could obviously disembowel a human in one neat stroke, and the disconcerting red glow of the sunken eyes that gave her the feeling she was peering deep into the bowels of hell. Then the other one arrived, much more decorously than the first, and when he opened his mouth she was immediately transported back to earth, to Webster Groves, one of the caves of steel that she and Derek had once visited. And then the first one so confirmed that impression she could hardly contain herself. And when the second one, the one called Sinapo, had said, "Yes, welcome to our world, Miss Ariel Welsh," she had to turn away to suppress her laughter in an incipient sneeze caused by the tingling in her nose from the faint odor of ammonia they exuded. She could hardly contain the delighted relief that came with the knowledge that these demons had a comic side. They were just naturally provincials of a Webster Grove persuasion. Will o' Nine could not possibly have given them that accent. She recovered quickly, however, and without sneezing she turned and said, "I am pleased to meet both of you." And then she bowed. "This is a historic occasion which we shall surely carry with us always. It saddens me that such an important meeting must be marred by the discussion of the discordant incidents that have occurred before we can explore the great potential for harmony in the future relations of our two species." She steeled herself to put his reply in the framework he surely intended, and she found she could quite easily ignore the thick accent and concentrate only on the meaning. "We are equally saddened," Sinapo replied. "The protocol of my species in this situation suggests that you should select the first topic for discussion," she said. Immediately Sinapo said, "Explain the square root of -1." His reply seemed completely at odds with the discussion she thought was going to take place. She was not schooled in mathematics, and was expecting more diplomatic double talk. She hesitated for just a moment, and then turned to Jacob and said, "Jacob?" Immediately Jacob said, "The square root of -1 is a member of a class of numbers that cannot be given substance except in a specific context. In this case, one such context is the interrelationship of space and time, in which the measurements of time must be multiplied by the square root of -1 in order to properly relate them to the measurement of space." "Or the reverse," Sinapo said. "A quite satisfactory answer to a simple question, but then one must start simple and work toward the complex. And now what is your pleasure, Miss Ariel Welsh?" "That sort of drivel isn't going to get us anywhere," Ariel thought. "Let's get right to it. Why have you isolated our city, and closed it under this big dome?" And as she gestured toward the dome, the first shimmer that morning, the first pass of the Meostrian construction, shot down the edge of the wall with a faint crackling and disappeared into the ground. Ariel jumped, startled. With the edge of the dome off to her left and to the rear, she had turned slightly as she gestured and had caught the shimmer at the corner of her eye before the sound reached her ears. Being to her back, though, it had startled her more than if she had been facing the edge. Sarko said, "Ah, my people have started work." Sinapo said, "My colleague Sarko informed me yesterday that the node compensator, this dome, will be completed tomorrow, so that leaves us little time for negotiation. He further informs me that the dome is necessary in order to properly control meteorological conditions. The particulate emissions and the radiation and convection of thermal energy from your creations are seriously disrupting the weather of our planet and thereby disturbing our mental processes and our emotional equanimity." The source of Sinapo's linguistic training came sharply into focus. He talked exactly like a robot city supervisor. Only Willer 9 could have downloaded all those big words. What had he said about work on the dome? It escaped her as she zeroed in on his last sentence. Jacob was right. The aliens were concerned about the weather, and talked as though they were actually controlling it. Spacers and settlers also talked about the weather a great deal, but so far not been able to do much about it. "You control the weather?" she said. "Of course, it is essential that unruly airflow not disturb our celebrations. How can one think when he is being bounced about in turbulence? Your creations generate a puncture node of the worst sort." "But now I believe it is our turn, and I suppose we must dispense with going methodically from the simple to the complex as I had intended. What vital purpose do your creations serve? What ends justify the killing of our two people? First, a Mystronian in legitimate pursuit of an assigned task, and then a Cerebron who was peacefully tethered and surely in no way interfering with your obscure endeavor." Ariel knew that, on balance, the destruction of a witness robot was hardly equal to the death of two intelligent beings, but she'd heard that a good offense was the best defense. "And in pursuit of that task of questionable legitimacy," Ariel replied, "your Meostrians created something that sliced one of my people in half." She didn't really think of a witness robot as people, but the Black Bats, or as Willer 9 termed them, the Black Bodies, didn't need to know that. "I respectfully remind you that it was your creations that caused the Meostrians to start construction of the compensator," Sinapos said. "And I ask again, what purpose do these creations serve? What further threat to our equilibrium lies beyond the disturbance of our weather?" It was a legitimate point, which caused her to re-evaluate what was serious and what was not, who had provoked whom, and when and how. Perhaps the weather was of equal importance to the sentient life in their minds. Perhaps the weather was their life. That thought, coupled with the observation that, while he was talking, he had slewed his hook around so it pointed forward, like that of his companion, caused Ariel to reconsider the gravity of the situation. Even though she didn't know for sure what that rotation meant, it didn't seem to bode any good, and might even be considered somewhat ominous, taken with the quiet way he had made his last pronouncement. She had let the provincial accent distract her, which may have caused her to consider this confrontation less serious than it really was. She had known how serious the situation was well before the meeting, and her anxiety had steadily increased until the moment of confrontation. How had she let the circumstances of their meeting so distract and deceive her? The shimmer at the corner of her eye at that moment, and the crackling sound that accompanied it, marked the pass of a Maestrian far above, and brought her attention back to the construction of the dome. She noticed then that, while they had been talking, the edge of the dome had progressed toward the center of Main Street, closing the opening by at least 2 more meters on that one side, probably 4 meters considering both sides. The city robots had extended Main Street into a road across the plain to facilitate their exodus. The 2 edges of the wall were not far from the edge of the road itself, 4 lanes wide where it exited the dome. It was then that Sinapo's earlier comment came to the front of her mind. My colleague Sarko informed me yesterday that the node compensator, this dome, will be completed tomorrow, so that leaves us little time for negotiation. She had not forgotten it. It had simply been overlaid by a surfeit of sensory stimuli. It was difficult to take in all the data and digest it in proper order. But clearly they were in the midst of a negotiation in which she had reasoned herself into a corner, a fact that she must honorably acknowledge in the presence of these aliens. And time was running out. Perhaps that acknowledgment alone would buy her some time. A diplomat might have been duplicitous at that point, but Ariel had recognized earlier that she wasn't a diplomat. You take the data, you analyze it, and you proceed accordingly. Your argument is sound, Ariel said. It takes only a brief moment, having now all the facts, to recognize that we are the offenders and you are the offended. We ask for your patience. We ask that you stop construction of the dome while we consider how we may resolve this dilemma, leaving neither of our peoples with further injury and with harmonious relations restored. She recognized that wasn't quite right. Their relations had never been harmonious. That was her minor concession to the duplicity of diplomacy. Neither of the aliens said anything, but Ariel knew something was going on. Standing side by side, they had turned their top sections so that their hooks and eyes confronted one another briefly. Then they turned back to confront Ariel. We agree to a 1-day delay in the construction of the compensator following completion of today's effort. We will meet again tomorrow as we met today. Ariel felt a touch on her elbow and half turned as Jacob bent over to say softly, "Would it be helpful to know the present stability of their weather?" "I don't understand," she said just as softly. "How effective is the dome in its present state?" Jacob asked. "That data will enter into our reckoning of possibilities for resolution of the dilemma." 99.2% compensation, including the improvement allowed by consideration of both positive edge effects," Sarko said before Ariel could ask. Ariel understood then why Jacob had asked the question. "Could you live with that if we caused no further deleterious effects?" she asked. "Yes." As though not to be outdone by Ariel's lieutenant, Sarko asked, "Why do you discrete or jump modulate hyperwave when that signal fidelity and freedom from noise is so much better with continuous modulation?" That time Ariel didn't hesitate a second. She looked at Jacob and said simply, "Jacob?" The reply by Jacob was delayed by a distraction at that point. A small, tight, luminous green flame, no more than 10 centimeters long, bloomed in the blackness a few centimeters below Sinapo's eyes. But he said nothing. Jacob was distracted only momentarily, just long enough to register the spectrum and the flame temperature of pure hydrogen, co-blended with pure oxygen and a trace of ammonia. "We are not familiar with the continuous modulation," Jacob said. "Strange, you teleport with both types of transition," Sarko said. He seemed not to be disturbed by fire from Sinapo. "You yourself jumped here in discrete mode, and Willer 9 phase condensed here in continuous mode. Do you not recognize the parallel with hyperwave?" "I am not familiar in these technologies," Jacob replied. "We can only take your question under advisement." As though to avoid further discussion, Snappo turned abruptly, and with a short wobbling run and an awkward hop, he flapped into the air and started gracefully into a great climbing turn. Zarko hesitated only a moment, and then turned, wobbled, and with an even more awkward hop, quickly followed him. They were soon far above the dome. At the end of the dome construction activity that day, the edges of the dome had just started cutting into the 4-lane road.